In the autumn of 2003, on a gravel road outside of Creemore in Simcoe County, a 41-year-old woman named Lorna Fisk spent $1,240 on a used soil moisture meter, 14 bags of mycorrhizal inoculant, and $700 worth of bare-root hawthorn whips from a nursery in Barry that the man at the counter said he'd never sold to anyone in the county before. He said it twice, like she might change her mind. She didn't. She loaded the hawthorn into the back of her 2001 Dodge Ram herself, tied a piece of orange surveyor's tape to the longest bundle so it wouldn't catch anyone by surprise on the highway, and drove the 40 minutes back to her property on the Nottawasaga River without stopping. Her neighbor, Ted Kowalski, who ran beef cattle on the 200 acres east of her fence line, was moving a round bale with his tractor when she came up the road. He slowed down and watched her turn in. He could see the bundles of bare sticks in the truck bed. He had known Lorna Fisk for 11 years, and he didn't know what she was planting, but he made a note of it the way farmers make notes of unusual things, which is to say he filed it away and mentioned it to his wife at dinner. That was the beginning. Over the next 5 years, Nottawasaga Township would have a story to tell. And like most stories in rural Ontario, it didn't travel fast. It traveled the way cold travels, slowly into every corner, until you couldn't remember when things had been warm, from the grain elevator in Creemore to the coffee counter at the co-op in Collingwood, from the co-op to the rink in Stayner, from the rink to the church basements and the Legion Hall on Friday nights. And at every stop, the story got a little more specific, because Lorna Fisk, widow, apple grower, daughter of a cash crop farmer from Grey County, was not the kind of person you expected to be doing what she was doing. What she was doing looked to most people like throwing good money after bad. Let me tell you about Lorna Fisk, because what she did with those hawthorn whips over the next 5 years only makes sense if you understand who she was and where she came from. Lorna was born in 1962 on a grain and oilseed operation 12 miles east of Owen Sound, the oldest of 3 children. Her father, Hugh Dunbar, farmed soybeans and winter wheat and ran a small apple block on the south-facing slope behind the house, maybe 4 acres, on land that had been in the family since her great-uncle bought it out of a tax sale in 1931. The land was not remarkable. It was good gray clay loam on the slope and heavy clay at the bottom, and in the wet years the lower field flooded in April, and her father lost crop, and in the dry years the clay cracked in August, and he lost crop a different way. That was farming in Grey County. You managed what you could and you accepted what you couldn't. Hugh Dunbar was a methodical man. He kept receipts going back 20 years in a filing cabinet in the mudroom, and he kept a logbook, a green hardcover that he bought by the case from an office supply store in Owen Sound, in which he recorded planting dates, spray records, yield by field, and notes about weather. Not poetic notes. Practical ones. May 14, planted west field, soil temperature 10°C, late. He had green logbooks going back to 1974. When Lorna was old enough to walk the rows with him, he made her slow down. "You don't learn a field from the end of the row," he told her once. "You learn it from the middle of it, when you're wet to the knees and the tractor's 300 yards away and it's just you and the dirt." She remembered that. She had the memory people have when the thing that was said turned out to be true. Lorna married Patrick Fisk in 1990. Patrick had come up from Guelph, an agricultural economist who had left the consulting firm to buy a 40-acre apple operation north of Creemore with money he'd saved for 8 years and a loan from the Farm Credit Corporation that Lorna thought was too large, but didn't say so out loud. They expanded to 90 acres by 1996. Macintosh, Cortland, Honeycrisp, a small block of mutsu that Patrick had planted on a hunch, and that turned out to be the right hunch. It was a modest operation by Simcoe County standards, not small, not large enough to live on when the crop came in, and prices held at the packing house. Patrick died in March of 2001, a Wednesday, of a cerebrovascular event in the equipment shed during the late winter inventory. He was 44 years old. Lorna found him when she brought lunch out at noon. She called 911 from the cordless phone she kept in her coat pocket during the shoulder season, and then she went back out and sat with him on the equipment shed floor, because she was not willing to let him be alone in the cold. The ambulance took 22 minutes. Her brother came up from Guelph the following weekend and sat at her kitchen table with a list of names: land agents, a fruit farm liquidation specialist, a lawyer who handled estate sales. He said the operation was too much for one person. He said it with genuine concern, and that made it harder to disagree with. Lorna thanked him for coming and told him she had spring to get organized for. He drove back to Guelph. She went out to the orchard. She managed the operation alone for 2 growing seasons before the trees started telling her something she didn't know how to answer. What Lorna Fisk saw when she walked her orchard rows in those first years without Patrick was what her father had trained her to see, which was more than most people in the county were looking for. She saw that her lower blocks, the ones closest to the river and the ones that had been under intensive production for 15 years, were declining in ways that didn't show up on the yield sheets until the 3rd or 4th year of looking. The fruit size was smaller than it should have been for the tree age. The Cortland block on the east side was putting out blind wood, which meant the buds weren't breaking and the branches were dying back from the tips. Scab pressure was higher every year, even with the same spray program, and the soil in those lower blocks, when she pushed a probe into it, was compacted 3 inches down into something that felt like modeling clay, dense and airless and wrong. She had read about soil health. She had read the technical bulletins from Offray. She had read the trade magazines and the spray guides and the IPM newsletters that came in a pile every spring. But she was reading something different now. A quarterly journal out of Guelph, published by a soil ecologist named Dr. Rosalind Preece, a researcher from the University of Manitoba who had spent 15 years studying mycorrhizal networks in perennial fruit systems. The argument was not complicated. It was almost offensively simple once you sat with it. Apple trees in intensive monoculture orchards, mowed clean, herbicides stripped in the tree row, treated with fungicides multiple times per season, had lost most of their functional mycorrhizal communities. The fungi that should have been threading through the soil, extending the tree's root reach, pulling phosphorus and trace minerals from distances the roots couldn't reach alone, were gone. Not slightly reduced. Gone. And without them, the trees were operating on about 60% of their potential capacity, regardless of how much fertilizer you added. Because fertilizer didn't replace biology. It replaced a few of the outputs of biology, temporarily, while the underlying system continued to weaken. The solution involved stopping the herbicide strip in the tree row, seeding specific understory plant communities, and inoculating new plantings with mycorrhizal fungi. Not complicated as an idea, expensive, disruptive, and philosophically opposed to everything the conventional production guides recommended as an execution. It also required hawthorn. Not hawthorn in the orchard, but hawthorn along the orchard margins, along the river edge, along the windbreak rows. Hawthorn and wild rose and dogwood, a dense, thorny, unglamorous hedgerow that would provide overwintering habitat for beneficial insects, reduce wind stress on the orchard floor, and host a suite of fungal communities that would gradually, over years, not seasons, migrate into the orchard's soil through hyphal networks that moved at the speed of root growth. You couldn't rush it. You could only plant the conditions for it. Lorna planted the hawthorn whips in November of 2003, 340 of them along the river edge and the south windbreak and the margins of the East Cortland block. They were ugly plants, bare, thorny, shin-high sticks pressed into the ground with a dibber bar, each one with a small flag of orange tape so she could find them again in the spring. She seeded the tree rows in the lower blocks with a fescue and legume mix that the spray guide explicitly recommended against, and the OMAFRA bulletin described as management-intensive and not generally recommended for commercial operations. Ted Kowalski drove past in December. He slowed his truck at the road and got out and stood at the fence for a few minutes, looking at the row of small orange flags along the river edge. The next morning at the elevator in Creemore, he mentioned it to Rob Patanud, who grew corn and soybeans on a section and a half west of the river, and who had an opinion about most things. Rob had driven past the Fisk place that fall, too. He'd seen Lorna out in the lower blocks on her hands and knees, pulling the herbicide mat back from the tree row and letting the grass come up. "She's letting the orchard go," Rob told Ted. "She's not spraying the rows. She's planting those things along the edge, whatever they are. Looks like she's putting the place back to bush." Ted said he didn't know about that. He said Lorna Fisk was not the kind of woman who let things go without a reason. Rob said maybe so, but the reason had better arrive before the scab did. because an unsprayed tree row was an invitation for every fungal problem in Simcoe County. They paid for their coffee. They went back to work. But the story had started. It went like this. In its early form, Lorna Fisk had not been herself since Patrick died. She'd gotten hold of some university idea about soil fungi and hedgerows, and she was out in the orchard doing things that went against 20 years of production guides, not spraying the row middles properly, planting thorn bushes along the fence line, letting the grass come up under the trees like she'd given up on weed control entirely. It didn't make sense. The production guides were the production guides. They existed because people with degrees and research budgets had figured out what worked. The story was told with something that sounded like concern, but functioned as entertainment. Lorna Fisk was not a woman people disliked. She was a woman people felt a particular kind of responsible for, the way communities feel responsible for someone who is visibly making a mistake in slow motion and hasn't noticed yet. Ted Kowalski's wife Gail mentioned it to her sister in Collingwood. Her sister mentioned it to the woman at the packing house who handled the Fisk account and who had in fact noticed that Lorna's Cortland volume was down again that autumn, which fit the story in a way that wasn't helpful to Lorna. By the second year, 2004, the hawthorn had leafed out and looked less like sticks and more like something that belonged, which was worse in a way because belonging made it permanent. The grass in the Cortland row middles was knee-high by July. Lorna was mowing it on a 3-week rotation instead of spraying, which meant more tractor time and more cost, and a look that anyone driving past County Road 9 would read as a place where standards had slipped. What they couldn't see from the road was what Lorna was measuring. She had started keeping her own logbook, a green hardcover, the same brand her father had used, because she had found a case of them in the mudroom when she was cleaning out Patrick's filing system, and it had seemed right to use them. She recorded soil temperature, soil moisture at 4 inches and 12 inches, and 12 inches, earthworm counts per square foot from a series of fixed sample points she'd marked with small metal stakes in each block, and, beginning in 2004, visual canopy assessments block by block, rating the percentage of blind wood, the extension growth on new shoots, and the number of buds breaking per spur cluster. The numbers in the lower Cortland block were not good yet. She knew they wouldn't be yet. Dr. Price's research was explicit about timeline. Meaningful soil biology recovery in a depleted system required a minimum of 3 to 4 years of consistent management change before measurable outcomes appeared. Lorna was in year 2. She was measuring because her father had taught her to measure, and because the only way to know whether nothing was happening or whether something was happening too slowly to see was to write down what you found every time you looked. She was also corresponding by email with 2 other orchardists, one in the Annapolis Valley in Nova Scotia and one outside of Kelowna in British Columbia, who were trialing similar approaches. These were long emails, specific and technical, about timing of mycorrhizal inoculation, species composition of understory mixes, how to handle the regulatory requirements around reduced spray programs and still meet the packing house's residue testing protocols. Lorna's internet bill went up. She was online late most evenings, which her neighbor, Gail Kowalski, noticed in the winter when Lorna mentioned it casually at the rink, and which got added to the story in the way all small details get added, not maliciously, just because the story was already there and the detail fit. The version of the story at the Legion Hall in 2005 was gentle but firm. Lorna Fisk was a capable woman who had been through a hard loss and had gotten hold of an academic idea that the practical world hadn't caught up with yet. She was running an experiment on commercial orchard land that she couldn't afford to run an experiment on. Eventually, the numbers would tell her what experience could have told her faster, and then she'd come back to the production guides like everyone else. In 2005, a graduate student from the University of Guelph named Philippa Osei knocked on Lorna's door. She was doing her master's research on mycorrhizal community recovery in Ontario fruit systems, and she had read Dr. Price's journal and had been trying to find the commercial operation in the province that was doing anything like what the research described. The Ontario Apple Growers Office had no one to refer her to. The packing house in Collingwood hadn't heard of it. An orchardist in the Beaver Valley had given her Lorna's name. Lorna made tea and took Philippa out to the blocks for 3 hours. Philippa was 26, careful, unhurried, the kind of researcher who got down on her hands and knees in the dirt and looked at it the way Lorna's father had looked at it, like it was a document she was trying to read. She looked at Lorna's logbooks. She pulled earthworms out of the sample points and counted them. She asked about the inoculation timing and the hawthorn establishment, and whether Lorna had seen any visual change yet in the blind wood ratios in the Cortland block. Before she left, she asked if she could come back the following summer and establish some formal measurement protocols. Comparison plots between Lorna's managed blocks and the conventionally managed sections she still ran on the upper ground. Soil cores, fungal hyphal density counts, the full picture. Lorna said yes. She didn't tell Philippa that she had already chosen which neighboring properties she had in mind for the external comparison. She thought she'd let the data do that work. Philippa came back in June of 2006 with 2 other graduate students, a set of soil coring equipment, and a summer's worth of counting root-associated fungi at 40 times magnification. By 2006, the story in Nottawasaga Township had been running for 3 years. 3 years of the hawthorn growing along the fence lines, 3 years of the long grass in the Cortland rows, 3 years of Lorna out in the orchard at first light, with her green logbook, and the people who drove past the Fisk place on County Road 9 had started to notice something they couldn't quite account for. The orchard looked different. Not the way a well-kept orchard looks different from a neglected one. More like the way a room looks different when someone has changed the light in it and you notice before you figure out why. Ted Kowalski had stopped his truck at the fence line one morning in May and gotten out and stood there. He had been running cattle for 30 years, and he understood something about grass and soil, and he was not sure what he was looking at in Lorna's Cortland block, but the trees had canopy in them he hadn't seen in years. More green, more weight in the branches. He didn't say anything about it because he also remembered Rob Botanadu saying last fall that the scab pressure on those trees looked lighter than it had in the previous 2 seasons, and Rob had said it in a tone that suggested it was an accident, which it might have been. At the co-op in Collingwood that spring, the story about Lorna Fisk's hedgerows and her long grass came up one more time, told by someone who had heard it third hand and gotten most of the details approximately right. But the laughter this time was shorter. A couple of the people at the counter didn't laugh. One woman, a vegetable grower from the north end of the county, asked a question instead of laughing, which was new. The summer of 2007 was dry. Not a historic drought, not the summer that gets remembered for a generation, but the kind of dry August that Ontario produces every several years, the kind that shows up what's underneath the surface of everything because there's nothing left on top to hide it. The orchards across Simcoe County went under moisture stress in the 2nd week of August. Fruit sizing slowed. Some growers were seeing early drop, which meant the trees were shedding fruit they didn't have the resources to carry to maturity. On Lorna's lower blocks, the blocks she had been managing for 4 years, with understory cover and no herbicide strip, and the hawthorn thick now along the river edge, and the south windbreak, the soil moisture readings at 12 inches were holding 2 full percentage points above her upper conventionally managed blocks when she checked in the 2nd week of August. 2% doesn't sound like much. It translates, in a mature apple block under heat stress, to the difference between a tree that drops 30% of its crop and a tree that drops 8. Her Cortland came off in September at 182 grams average fruit size. Her neighbor's Cortland, same rootstock, similar planting age, 3 kilometers north on the same county road, came off at 156 grams. Lorna didn't tell anyone. She wrote it in the logbook and put the logbook on the shelf next to the case of empties. Philippa Osei called in October from Guelph. She had been careful on the phone the way young researchers are careful when the numbers have come back looking cleaner than they expected. She told Lorna that in the managed lower blocks, the hyphal density count in the top 6 inches of soil was 340% higher than in the conventional upper blocks. The earthworm population at the fixed sample points was up 280% compared to the baseline from 2005. She'd found 7 mycorrhizal fungal species in the managed blocks that she hadn't detected at all in the comparison plots on the neighboring property. There was a pause on the line. "How confident are you?" Lorna asked. "Very," Philippa said. "The soil in those lower blocks is doing something different. It's measurable and it's real." Lorna thanked her, wrote the numbers in the logbook, and put the phone down. She went out to the equipment shed and stood in the doorway for a while looking at the dark shapes of the trees in the lower block. She had been watching for 4 years. She had been patient in the way her father had been patient, which was not the comfortable kind of patience, but the working kind, the kind where you keep measuring and recording and checking and doing the thing even on the days when the thing seemed like it might be wrong. The number was real. The trees were real. But she was her father's daughter about one thing above all else, which was that a grower who talked before the data was fully in invited the kind of doubt that was hard to shake. She wasn't ready. The winter of 2007 to 2008 was hard in a way that rural Ontario winters are hard when you are alone on a property and there is no one to share the weight of it. The furnace went in January. A fox got into the laying flock she kept in a small shed near the house and killed 11 birds. The lane iced over in February and she slid the truck into the ditch twice in the same week. These were not dramatic hardships. They were the ordinary inventory of a hard winter, the kind of list that exists for everyone and that most people have someone to read it to. Lorna read it to the green logbook, which was not the same. In March of 2008, the Nottawasaga Apple Growers Association held its annual meeting at the Township Hall in Creemore. 31 growers attended. The agenda covered packing house pricing, a federal cost-share program for frost protection equipment, and a presentation from an OMAFRA specialist on fire blight management. Lorna attended. She sat near the back. She listened. Near the end of the meeting, a grower named Hugh Sewell, who ran one of the larger operations in the county, said he'd been getting materials in the mail from a soil health organization in Guelph and had been reading about some kind of biological approach to orchard floor management. He wasn't sure what to make of it. He held up a pamphlet. "Anyone been following any of this?" he asked the room. A short silence. "That's what Lorna Fisk has been doing for 5 years. Ted Kowalski said it from the third row, not looking up from his program, just stating a fact." Then he looked toward the back of the room. 30 heads turned. Lorna looked at Ted. She looked at Hugh Sewell. She looked at the pamphlet, which was from Dr. Price's research group, which she had been receiving since 2003. "How long?" you asked. 5 years, she said, "since the fall of 2003. The room went quiet in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when something that has been moving underground surfaces unexpectedly, not with noise, just with the adjustment of everyone's weight, the slight settling that happens when the furniture of a conversation rearranges itself. "I'd like to hear about it," you said. What happened over the following spring was not the kind of thing that makes a story in the conventional sense. There was no single afternoon, no town square moment. What happened was quieter than that, and it was the quietness that made it stick. Hugh Sewell drove out to the Fisk place in April. He was a practical man in the way that growers who'd been doing this long enough to have seen several fashions come and go are practical, skeptical by default and persuadable by evidence. He walked the lower Cortland block with Lorna for 2 hours. He looked at the canopy. He got down on one knee in the tree row and pushed his thumb into the soil and said nothing for a moment. He asked about the Hawthorn establishment cost and the time required for the understory management. He asked to see the logbooks. She brought him to the equipment shed and showed him 5 years of green hardcovers on the shelf. He stood in the Cortland block for a long time before he said anything. "My father always said you could read an orchard block by looking at the fruit in the 10th row," he said. "Not the first row, not the last row. The 10th row, that's where the block tells you the truth, because nobody ever manages the 10th row for the people watching from the road." He looked at the 10th row of the Cortland block. "I could sell fruit from this 10th row," he said. Lorna said nothing. "My 10th rows look like the ones at the end," Hugh said. He ordered mycorrhizal inoculant and hawthorn stock from a native plant nursery in Barrie in May. Ted Kowalski came by in late April without calling ahead. He found Lorna doing canopy assessment in the Macintosh block, moving down the row with her logbook, rating buds on a scale she'd developed herself because there wasn't a commercial standard for what she was looking for. He walked the row with her without asking. When they reached the end, he said, "I've driven past your place twice a week for 5 years. She waited. "I told Gail you were setting yourself up for a bad lesson," he said. "I said it more than once, and I said it to people who are going to repeat it." "I know," she said. "I want to talk to that Guelph student you had out here," he said. "Oh, say." "She's good," Lorna said. "Ask her about the hyphal density numbers." Rob Patanady was last. Rob had the most to let go of, because Rob had been the first to give the story its most lasting detail. The one about Lorna letting the place go back to bush, and that phrase had traveled further than most, because it was vivid and it stuck. Rob came to Lorna's door on a Saturday morning in May with a flat of bedding plants from the garden center in Barrie that he'd bought for Lorna as a gesture he couldn't quite name but felt was right. He stood on the porch and handed them to her. "My Cortland block came off at 149 grams last year," he said. "Yours came off at 182. I checked with the packing house." Lorna opened the screen door wider. "Come in," she said. "I'll show you the logbooks. Let me tell you about the summer of 2008, because the summer of 2008 was the one that settled things. It was not a catastrophic year. Ontario orchardists have seen worse. But it was a summer of compounding pressures, a late spring frost that caught the early blooms in the Macintosh block across the county, a dry stretch in July, and then a run of wet weather in August that pushed scab pressure higher than it had been in a decade. By September, the growers who had been running standard spray programs were managing significant scab on their late-season varieties, and some were looking at a 40% cull rate on their Cortland, which was the volume variety that most of them depended on for packing house revenue. On Lorna's lower blocks, the ones under biological management, scab incidence was less than 9%. She had not changed her spray program significantly, not reduced it below what the IPM threshold system recommended. What had changed was the canopy architecture, which was now open and self-ventilating in the lower blocks in ways that reduced the humid microclimates where scab spores established. And what had changed was the tree vigor, which in a genuinely healthy tree is not a cosmetic quality but a functional one, because a tree with a functioning root system and a full mycorrhizal community has better access to the calcium and boron that determine cell wall integrity. And cell wall integrity is the first line of defense against fungal penetration. Lorna's cull rate was 9%. The county average was 31. She did not call anyone. She wrote it in the logbook and drove the fruit to the packing house in Collingwood herself. 3 loads over 2 days, and the grader on the intake line said, without knowing whose orchard it came from, that this was some of the cleanest Cortland she'd seen come off Simcoe County ground in years. Lorna thanked her and drove home. The story that had been circulating for 5 years, from the elevator to the co-op to the rink to the Legion Hall, changed direction in the fall of 2008. Not loudly. Stories in rural Ontario don't change direction loudly. They shift, the way a river shifts after a flood, finding new channels while the old ones fill in, and one day you notice the water is going somewhere different, and you can't say exactly when it started. By October, the native plant nursery in Barrie had fielded calls from 6 Simcoe County orchardists asking about hawthorn establishment for orchard margin hedgerows. The woman who ran the nursery called Lorna to ask what was happening because she'd never had 6 calls from the same county in 1 month. Philippa Osei came back in September with her supervisor, a senior researcher who had been skeptical of the project's commercial applicability and who had agreed to come and look. He spent 2 days on the property. He pushed his hands into the soil. He looked at the canopy architecture in the managed blocks and the conventional upper blocks side by side. He stood at the fence line between the 2 systems for a long time, saying very little. On the drive back to Guelph, he told Philippa her thesis was going to be fine. In the spring of 2009, the Ontario apple growers held a regional workshop on orchard floor management in Barrie, the same organization that had told Philippa Osei in 2005 that it had no one to refer her to who was working on biological soil health approaches. They asked Lorna Fisk to present the case study. Lorna said she would, and then spent 2 weeks deciding what to bring. She brought her logbooks, 5 years of green hardcovers in a canvas bag. She brought Philippa's published paper, which had come out that winter in a Canadian horticultural research journal. She brought the packing house grade sheets from 2007 and 2008. She brought, for reasons she didn't explain to anyone, the case of green logbooks from the mudroom, still in the original box, the ones that had belonged to her father and that she had never opened. She stood up in front of 63 orchardists in a conference room in Barrie and spread the logbooks on the table in front of her and started at the beginning. She had not prepared remarks. She had the logbooks and the data, and she explained them the way her father had explained a field, from the inside out, one thing at a time, without ornament. She told them what the lower blocks had looked like in 2003. She told them what she'd been reading and why. She told them what hawthorn cost and how long it took to establish and what the understory management program looked like in time and equipment hours per acre. She showed them the hyphal density numbers and the fruit size comparison and the 2008 scab incidence against the county average. When she was done, Hugh Sewell asked the first question. Rob Pattinaud asked the second. Ted Kowalski didn't ask a question. He looked at his hands and then at the logbooks on the table. The questions went on for 2 hours. Lorna answered all of them. She said "I don't know" 4 times, each time about something specific, and wrote down names of researchers or growers she could put the questioner in touch with for follow-up. Near the end, a grower from Thornbury, a man who had been running a family apple operation for 30 years, and who had come to the workshop with considerable skepticism written into the set of his jaw, raised his hand. "Miss Fisk," he said, "I have to ask. When you were out there in 2004 and 2005 with those thorn bushes and the long grass in your tree rows and everybody in the county thought you'd taken a wrong turn, did you ever wonder if they were right?" The room went quiet. Lorna looked at the man for a moment. "Every week," she said. "That's why I kept the logbooks." The room was quiet in a different way then. The kind of quiet that happens when something true gets said plainly in a room full of people who recognize it. Not because it surprises them, but because they hadn't expected to hear it out loud. By 2011, 11 orchards in Simcoe and Grey counties were running biological floor management programs with mycorrhizal inoculation and structured hedgerow plantings. Not all of them were getting the same results, because the results require patience that is harder to maintain than it sounds, and a willingness to keep measuring even when the measurements are telling you nothing yet. But 11 operations were trying. Hugh Sewell's lower blocks, after 3 full seasons under biological management, were producing fruit that he told Ted Kowalski was the best sizing fruit he'd grown since his father was alive. He didn't say that publicly until the 4th year. He could measure it back to back. Ted Kowalski converted his orchard margin management in 2009. He said it took 2 full seasons before he saw anything he would call a result, and he told Rob Pattinaud that the hardest part was the second spring, when the hawthorn looked dead and the grass was wrong and nothing seemed to be responding yet, and you had to keep going anyway. Rob Pattinaud was last. He was the most thorough once he started. He called Lorna in the evenings sometimes to ask about timing and inoculation rates, and their conversations were long and specific. She never said anything about the phrase "going back to bush" that had attached itself to her place for 3 years. She just answered the questions. Rob noticed that. Philippa O.C. defended her doctoral thesis in 2010. One chapter was a full case study of the Fisk operation, covering 5 years of data under the title "Mycorrhizal Community Recovery in a Commercially Managed Apple System, a Longitudinal Study in Southern Ontario." The language was careful and precise, the way academic language has to be, hedged with methodology sections and confidence intervals. What it said, underneath the hedges, was that 5 years of biological management had produced statistically significant improvements in soil fungal diversity, plant available nutrient cycling, fruit quality metrics, and disease resistance indicators that had no adequate explanation under conventional intensive orchard management assumptions. Lorna read it twice. She thought the language undersold what the trees themselves said if you stood in them, but she understood why it had to be careful. Careful language in a published paper is what makes the thing defensible when someone who doesn't want to believe it goes looking for the flaw. In the spring of 2013, the Nottawasaga Township Agricultural Society held its annual field day on the Fisk property. The extension worker who organized it said afterward that it was the best attended field day they'd run in Simcoe County in 15 years. 71 growers came. They parked along County Road 9 and walked into the gate in small groups, some of them people Lorna had never met, from as far as Prince Edward County and the Holland Marsh. Lorna met them at the gate and took them to the lower Courtland block first, the block that had looked worst in 2003, the one with the blind wood and the compacted soil and the scab pressure she hadn't known how to answer. She walked them through it one section at a time. She showed them the logbooks on the equipment shed wall. 10 years of green hardcovers in a row, pencil in the same handwriting from start to finish. She showed them where the apple trees now had visible surface root systems threading through the understory grass, which meant the soil was alive enough to reward surface root growth, which a compacted herbicide-stripped orchard floor never does. She let them push their thumbs into the soil and feel it. A grower from Prince Edward County, a man in his mid-60s who had been running his family's stone fruit operation since the 1980s, pushed his thumb into the tree row soil in the lower Cortland block and then walked to the fence line and pushed his thumb into the soil in the conventionally managed strip on the other side. He stood there for a moment. "Different countries," he said. "Same ground," Lorna said. 10 years. The man looked at the fence line. "My grandfather farmed stone fruit on clay loam in Picton," he said. "He thought the soil was just what it was, that you worked with what the county gave you." "My father thought the same," Lorna said. "He paid more attention than most, but he didn't have what I was reading." "What were you reading?" the man asked. Lorna told him. She gave him the name of the journal, the research group in Guelph, the names of 2 orchardists in Nova Scotia he could contact directly. She wrote it on a page torn from the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. The same brand her father had used, which she had been carrying since she found his last unopened pack in the mudroom after the funeral. The man folded the paper and put it in his chest pocket. "I've got 30 acres on the east side of my property," he said. "Heavy clay. Looks like a road when it dries." He looked at the Cortland trees, full canopied, dark green and settled. "I'm 67. Think it's worth starting?" Lorna looked at him steadily. "It took 10 years to get here," she said. "You might not see the end of it, but you'll see enough of it to know." The man nodded slowly. He looked at the trees for a moment longer. Then he took out the notebook Lorna had written on and added something below what she'd written, which was his own property information, because he had already decided to call the nursery in Barrie on the way home. The 71 growers and Lorna Fisk stood in the lower Cortland block that May morning, looking at the orchard that 10 years ago had been losing ground one blind bud at a time, and that nobody who drove past on County Road 9 had believed she could bring back with a bundle of hawthorn whips and a case of green logbooks and a case of green logbooks and a willingness to wait longer than the county thought was reasonable. The wind came off the Nottawasaga the way it comes in May in Simcoe County, cool and honest and smelling of the river. The apple trees moved in it, not dramatically, just the small adjustments that living things make to moving air. Lorna watched the Cortland block the way her father had taught her to watch things that mattered, which was the way you watch something you have built an agreement with, not a contract, not a transaction, but the slower kind of agreement, the kind written in soil and season and patient work, the kind that takes so long to form that by the time it shows up you have almost stopped expecting it. 5 years of being the subject of a story she hadn't asked to be in. 5 years of the long grass and the thorn bushes and the green logbooks, and the evenings on the phone with people in Nova Scotia and British Columbia who were watching the same things she was watching. And then the trees. That is the difference between someone who sees what a piece of land is doing and someone who sees what it is trying to do. Lorna Fisk spent $1,340 on hawthorn whips, an inoculant that everyone in Nottawasaga Township said was an expensive way to let a good orchard go soft. On land everyone said could only run one way, with an idea everyone said had come from too far inside a university to mean anything in Simcoe County. She kept the logbooks. She kept the records. She kept the small notebook in her coat pocket. And in the summer of 2008, when the scab came and the county cull rate hit 31%, the Cortland and Lorna Fisk's lower blocks, deep-rooted, biologically alive, patient in the way the woman who tended it was patient, came off the trees at 9%, cull and 182 grams. Not magic, not luck, just the work of something that had been going on underground for long enough to matter. I keep thinking about that screwdriver. Not the soil probe Philippa brought from Guelph with her coring equipment and her methodology sheets. The ordinary flathead that Lorna kept bent at 1 inch, the one she pushed into the same spots in the same blocks every spring and wrote down how deep it went before it hit resistance. That's the image I come back to. A woman alone in a field at first light, crouched down in wet grass, measuring something nobody else in the county believed was changing. What strikes me most about Lorna's story is not the 2008 numbers, not the 9% cull rate against a county average of 31, not even the moment at the Barrie workshop when the room went quiet after she said every week an answer to a question about doubt. What strikes me is the 5 years before any of that. The 5 years when the logbooks were just logbooks and the hawthorn was just a row of ugly sticks along the fence line, and nobody driving past on County Road 9 could see anything that looked like progress because progress was happening underground, out of sight, at the speed that living things actually move when you give them the conditions they need. There's something in that I think about when I consider what it actually takes to do something right. Not impressive right, not clever right, just genuinely, quietly, stubbornly right, in a way that takes longer than anyone around you thinks is reasonable. Lorna didn't have certainty. She said so herself. Every week she wondered if the county was correct and she was wrong. What she had instead of certainty was something more durable than certainty, which was a method. She read carefully. She measured honestly. She recorded what she found, even when what she found was nothing yet, and she kept going. That's not faith in the religious sense. It's something more like intellectual honesty carried all the way through to its conclusions, even the inconvenient ones, even the ones that cost you something socially, even the ones that require standing in a wet field at 6 in the morning pushing a bent screwdriver into the dirt and writing down a number that hasn't changed. That kind of honesty takes a particular kind of character. It requires you to care more about what is actually true than about what people think of you while you're finding out. It requires you to sit with uncertainty without letting the uncertainty make your decisions for you. And it requires, above everything, the willingness to keep working when the work isn't producing results you can show anyone yet. Not because you're stubborn in the blind way, but because you've looked at the evidence carefully enough to believe that the results are coming and that stopping would cost more than waiting. What Rob Patena stood on Lorna's porch holding that Saturday morning in May wasn't just bedding plants. It was the end of a story he'd told about her for 5 years, the one about going back to Bush, the one that had traveled further than he'd intended. He came back because the grade sheets at the packing house were a fact, and facts, eventually, are louder than stories. That's the cause and effect underneath everything in Lorna's story. The decision she made in 2003 produced the soil that produced the roots that produced the fruit that produced the numbers in 2008. Nothing in between was luck. Every step was the outcome of something she had chosen to understand and act on, even when acting on it was uncomfortable, even when it made her the subject of a conversation at the Legion Hall on a Friday night. I don't think what Lorna did was exceptional in the sense of being out of reach. I think it was ordinary in the best possible way. She read, she measured, she worked, she waited, she kept the logbooks, she answered questions honestly, including the question about doubt, which is the hardest one. The 10th row of that Cortland block didn't lie. It never does. The question is only whether you're willing to walk out to it and look.